Before you get too comfortable, consider this. Imagine a country where your fitness tracker isn't on your wrist. It's in the hands of the government. They're not counting your steps. They're counting your worth. Welcome to Sparta, the world's first state-sponsored gym, with a 100% fatal no-refund policy. For centuries, we've been told Sparta was a paradise of discipline, courage, and impossible warriors. Men who could fight barefoot in the snow, eat a single bowl of black soup a day, and still win battles through sheer intimidation. But what history politely left out is that the Spartan miracle wasn't born from strength. It was engineered through cruelty. This was a society that looked at human beings the way farmers look at livestock, breeding, testing, and discarding until only the strongest remained. If you passed, congratulations, you were property of the army. If you failed, well, let's just say the ancient Greeks had creative ways of streamlining their population. To the outside world, Sparta was terrifyingly perfect. But behind the bronze helmets and abdominal muscles that Hollywood can't stop filming, there was something far darker. A machine designed to strip away weakness, emotion, and individuality. One child at a time. They didn't call it childhood. They called it preparation. A Spartan baby didn't belong to its parents. It belonged to the state. At birth, government-appointed inspectors decided whether a newborn was fit enough to live. And no, this wasn't a metaphorical fit. They literally examined babies like produce at a farmer's market. If the child was too weak, too small, or had any visible imperfection, it was returned to nature. In modern terms, imagine your baby's first checkup being handled by a national fitness coach with a sword. This wasn't cruelty by accident. It was ideology. Sparta believed the body was sacred only if it could serve the state. Everything else, love, art, curiosity, weakness, was waste. Even their philosophers didn't argue about the meaning of life. They argued about how to make life more efficient. And this efficiency went so far that a Spartan father could lose his child, not to illness, not to war, but to bureaucracy. Because in Sparta, parenthood wasn't a right. It was a privilege granted by the government. You might be thinking, that sounds insane. And yes, it does. But before you laugh, ask yourself, how different is it really from a modern system that ranks people by test scores, body fat, or social media metrics? Sparta just did it. Without the Wi-Fi. They measured perfection in muscle, obedience, and the ability to die without flinching. And for nearly 300 years, it worked. Or at least, it looked like it did. Until the same obsession with perfection that made them unbeatable, made them unsustainable. Because when you breed a society to never fail, you also breed one that can't forgive itself when it finally does. By the end of this story, you'll see Sparta not as a nation of heroes, but as a warning. An empire that tried to play God, and learned that gods don't do empathy. From state-controlled births to psychological warfare disguised as education, this is how Sparta manufactured its citizens like weapons, and how the pursuit of perfection turned the cradle of courage into a graveyard of humanity. Sparta didn't raise soldiers, as one ancient traveler wrote. It harvested them, and the harvest began the moment you were born. Before we dive deeper, consider hitting that like button and subscribe if you like what I do here. I'd also love to hear from you. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Chapter 1. The Birth That Decided Your Fate. In most parts of the ancient world, a child's first cry was a celebration. In Sparta, it was an inspection notice. When a Spartan baby came into the world, the mother's first job wasn't to name it. It was to wait. Wait for the elders to arrive. Men from the Gerousia, the council of old warriors, gray-bearded veterans who believed themselves experts in both battle and biology. They didn't carry scrolls or scales. They carried judgment. Each newborn was lifted high to the light like a product under warranty. Did the chest expand fully? Were the limbs straight? Was the head well-shaped? The cry strong? If the answer to any of these was no, the verdict was silent but final. The infant was taken away, not murdered in rage, but removed as policy. Sparta, they said, could not afford weakness. Their word for compassion might as well have been defect. Modern parents share photos, Spartan parents shared statistics. Healthy boy, full lungs, 10 fingers, approved. If a father hesitated, the inspectors reminded him, "Your child is not yours. He belongs to the city." It was the world's earliest state-controlled eugenics program, centuries before anyone had a term for it. Legend claims the rejected babies were thrown from the Mount Taygetus cliffs, but historians think the truth was quieter and crueler. The unwanted were left in wild ravines, where nature would decide quickly. To the Spartans, this wasn't murder. It was maintenance. You could almost admire the logic, if it weren't so terrifying. Every other Greek city prayed for good harvests. Sparta prayed for good genetics. Even marriage had rules. Couples were paired less for love and more for symmetry. Elders whispered that broad shoulders should meet narrow hips, tall women with shorter men to balance proportions, as if the gods themselves were running a breeding algorithm. Love poems? Rare. Workout routines? Mandatory. Spartan mothers were told to exercise while pregnant, to keep the womb fit. No scented oils, no gentle music, just squats and discipline. They were the original prenatal coaches, except the reward wasn't a baby shower. It was national security. Better to lose one child than weaken the city, said a Spartan proverb. They meant it. The city believed a perfect soldier began long before birth, a human designed in draft form, shaped by policy, hardened by philosophy, and finished in training. And yet, amid this machine, one thing remained hauntingly human. When a mother handed her newborn to the elders, sometimes she smiled, not because she was proud, but because she had learned the Spartan smile, tight-lipped, unshaking, the expression of someone who has surrendered emotion to survive. From the outside, Sparta looked strong. Inside, it was already cracking. Because when you breed out weakness, you also breed out empathy. And empathy, as history keeps proving, is the one thing that makes strength worth having. Next came the Agoge, the state's answer to childhood itself, where boys became property and obedience replaced identity. Chapter 2. Raised by the state, not the family. In most ancient cities, a child belonged to the household. In Sparta, the household belonged to the state. Love was not forbidden, it was simply irrelevant. A Spartan parent could hold their child, teach them to walk, whisper a lullaby. But deep down, they knew it wasn't theirs to keep. The city decided when the child would eat, when they would sleep, and eventually, when they would leave. To outsiders, this seemed barbaric. But to Spartans, it was the ultimate act of patriotism. They didn't say, "I love my son." They said, "I offer him." Because in Sparta, children were not born into families. They were born into service. Sparta was not like Athens, where art and argument were the lifeblood of the city. They didn't believe in debate. They believed in direction. And every citizen, no matter how small, had one. Even the nursery was political. The first toys a Spartan child received weren't dolls or carved animals. They were miniature shields, not to play with, but to hold. To learn balance before words, strength before thought. The city's rulers, the ephors, oversaw every stage of upbringing. They were like moral accountants, ensuring every citizen paid their debt to the state, even in childhood. To them, affection was indulgence, and indulgence was decay. So mothers learned to speak softly, but not too warmly. Fathers learned to nod at their sons, but never embrace them. A hug in Sparta was a liability. Each home was a miniature garrison. Even family dinners were military briefings in disguise. Fathers told their sons stories of courage and discipline, not affection. Mothers repeated the same phrase every boy would carry to adulthood: "Come back with your shield, or on it." It wasn't a metaphor. It was a parenting strategy. There were no birthdays in Sparta, no festivals for children. The only celebration that mattered was survival. If a child made it to 7, the state considered it a success story, not for the family, but for the city. And that's when the real upbringing would begin. When the summons came, there were no tears, no protests. It was simply understood. The city had called. A small boy would be taken by the hand and led to a public square where a new group of elders waited. No toys, no parents, just the next phase. The family watched him go, quietly, stoically, because in Sparta, grief was treason. To weep for your child was to admit the city's design was flawed. What Athens achieved through philosophy, Sparta achieved through psychology. It didn't just command obedience, it made obedience sacred. The children would grow up believing their parents were just the first guardians, temporary keepers until the state took over. And so, as the sun set over the red-tiled roofs of Laconia, another generation disappeared behind the marble walls of Sparta's training halls. Not to learn words, not to learn music, but to learn endurance. Because the next morning, before dawn, every boy would wake to a new name, a new home, and a new purpose. The Agoge awaited, the place where childhood ended and conditioning began. Chapter 3. The Agoge. Training for pain. The morning Sparta took your son, it didn't just take him from your home. It took him from himself. The Agoge began at dawn, before the city's roosters had even decided to wake. The boys arrived barefoot, shivering, still clinging to the idea that childhood might be something soft. By nightfall, that idea would be beaten out of them, literally. The Agoge wasn't a school. It was an assembly line for the human spirit. The goal wasn't to teach, it was to condition, to erase the individual until only obedience remained. Every dawn began the same way, not with breakfast, but with shouting. Instructors called paidonomoi, child herders, stormed through the barracks like drill sergeants possessed by philosophy. Their motto might as well have been, "If it doesn't hurt, it doesn't work." Shoes, band, blankets, weakness, warmth, suspicious. If your feet cracked from the cold, you were told to run until the pain toughened them. If your stomach growled, you were told hunger was the body's way of saying, "Thank you for discipline." There were no rewards, only less punishment. And even that was rare. Meals were designed by sadists with nutrition degrees. A single ladle of black broth, pig's blood, vinegar, and salt sloshed in each bowl. If you didn't like it, good. If you vomited, better. Discomfort built character. Flavor built softness. Starving was part of the syllabus. Stealing was allowed, but getting caught wasn't. The lesson? Morality was irrelevant. Competence was divine. The Agoge believed that suffering was sacred. The more you endured, the more you belonged. At the annual festival of Artemis Orthia, boys were whipped at the altar until they fainted, or didn't. The crowd clapped, parents smiled, the priests kept count. The winners weren't rewarded. They were simply allowed to live. Discipline in the Agoge wasn't about survival. It was about obedience through pain. If your classmate collapsed, you didn't help him. You memorized how he fell so you'd never do it the same way. Empathy was a defect. Compassion was an infection. Every friendship was built on fear, every rivalry on silence. You could trust your comrade to protect your back in battle, but never to share his bread at dinner. By 12, each boy owned one cloak. Winter or summer didn't matter. The fabric rotted before it was replaced. They learned to sleep on reeds and call the bruises mattresses. At 13, they were sent into the wilderness with nothing but a knife and a prayer, not to survive nature, but to prove they could survive themselves. Some returned with scars, Some didn't return at all. Sparta called it graduation. At 15, the survivors stopped being boys. They stopped being anything, really. Each one a blank slate, efficient, loyal, and frighteningly quiet. Foreign visitors described them as beautifully controlled. Modern psychologists might say severely traumatized. Either way, the result was the same: a perfect soldier. The Agoge worked. It built bodies that could march for days without food, men who could sleep standing, and warriors who could smile at death like it was a familiar face. But in the process, it built something else, a nation incapable of tenderness. Because if you teach a child that mercy is weakness, don't be surprised when he grows into a man who no longer recognizes it. The Agoge had done its job. Sparta now had its army, thousands of warriors carved from fear and pride. But the experiment wasn't over. To keep perfection alive, the state had to breed it again. And that led to Sparta's darkest invention yet, a society where even love was government property. Chapter 4. Breeding the Next Generation. If the Agoge built warriors, Sparta still needed raw material, new bodies to mold, new children to offer. And in the logic of Sparta, reproduction was not romance. It was resource management. The state viewed sex the way a blacksmith views iron, useful only when it serves the forge. Marriage wasn't a love story. It was a breeding license. The ephors, Sparta's moral accountants, approved pairings the way modern scientists approve experiments. They called it strength optimization. Everyone else would call it terrifying. Spartan weddings were stranger than any myth. The bride's head was shaved, her clothes exchanged for a man's cloak, and she was left waiting in a darkened room. The groom arrived secretly, sometimes after midnight, because in Sparta, even intimacy required stealth. The couple met in shadows, fulfilled their civic duty, and went separate ways before sunrise. The idea was simple: keep emotion out of it. Love could confuse loyalty, affection could weaken resolve. And in a society where everything served the army, even passion had to march in step. If a husband proved infertile or weak, the state had solutions. A stronger man could be loaned to the wife, sometimes with the husband's consent, sometimes without. It wasn't scandal, it was science. Sparta had invented a kind of state-sponsored open marriage, and somehow managed to make it sound less fun than homework. Women were trained too, not for war, but for function. They exercised daily, raced, wrestled, and threw javelins. Not because Sparta believed in equality, it believed in eugenics. A fit mother, they said, would make fit sons. One Spartan poet bragged, "Our women bear warriors, not cowards." He forgot to mention they also bore the pressure of an entire civilization's expectations. Girls were taught to be strong, confident, and unyielding, not so they could rule, but so they could reproduce without weakness. Their bodies were national property, their wombs a form of currency. Even childbirth was measured by military standards. A woman who screamed too loudly during labor might be mocked for lacking discipline. In Athens, women were hidden behind curtains. In Sparta, they were paraded in stadiums, judged by posture, gait, and muscle tone. The ancients called it celebrating fertility. Modern audiences might call it a government-run beauty pageant from hell. When a child was born, the cycle began again, inspected, approved, or rejected. The family line existed not for legacy, but for output. It was the ancient world's cruelest assembly line, from mating to training to death, every stage perfectly calibrated for war. And yet, even within this system, a paradox formed. Spartan women, constrained by duty, became the most outspoken women in Greece. They insulted cowards, mocked husbands, and demanded sons return with shields rather than excuses. They weren't free, but they were feared. And in a city that worshipped fear, that was the closest thing to power. For a while, it worked. Sparta's population was small but terrifyingly efficient, a human elite bred for discipline. But perfection has a flaw. It doesn't scale. The very system that produced the strongest soldiers also produced the fewest citizens. By the 4th century BC, there were fewer than 1,000 true Spartans left to defend the myth. Sparta had engineered the perfect body, but it forgot to engineer the soul. And a nation without a soul can only win battles, never peace. Chapter 5. Women of Sparta, Freedom or Function. In Athens, a woman's name was spoken only in whispers. In Sparta, her voice carried across the training fields. It's one of history's strangest contradictions, a culture that treated women as property, yet gave them more rights than almost anywhere else in the ancient world. Foreign visitors called Spartan women liberated. But liberation in Sparta came with a catch. Your freedom only existed if it served the state. Spartan girls were raised like no other in Greece. While Athenian daughters learned weaving in silence, Spartan girls learned sprinting, wrestling, and how to throw a javelin farther than most men. They trained under the same sun, ate the same food, and were told from childhood that their bodies were instruments of destiny. A weak woman, they said, makes a weak womb, and a weak womb makes a weak army. So they raced, they fought, and they sweat, not for themselves, but for the sons they had not yet born. By law, women could own land and inherit wealth. It sounds progressive until you realize why. Men were too busy dying. Every Spartan husband lived in the barracks until age 30, returning home only occasionally, like a guest with visitation rights. The women ran the estates, managed slaves, oversaw the economy, but always in service of the war machine. They were CEOs of a company whose only product was soldiers. The rest of Greece couldn't decide whether to admire them or fear them. An Athenian philosopher once sneered, "The men of Sparta rule their wives by letting them rule everything else." He wasn't entirely wrong. Spartan women spoke freely because they were trained to. Confidence wasn't rebellion, it was policy. A loud woman inspired strong sons. A quiet one inspired suspicion. They marched naked in athletic festivals, their toned bodies glistening under the sun, cheered by crowds who pretended it was about health, not spectacle. Poets described them as the daughters of lions, but the truth was colder. Even their beauty was state property. Their strength wasn't empowerment, it was advertisement. Every stride, every muscle flexed was a recruitment poster for Sparta's ideology. And they learned early that mercy had no place here either. When a messenger once told a Spartan mother her 5 sons had died in battle, she replied, "Did we win?" When he nodded, she said, "Then I have no tears." That's not pride. That's conditioning with lipstick. Yet beneath all the propaganda and performance, there were cracks. Letters from outsiders describe women privately mourning, quietly praying for sons who would never return. And the same system that glorified them also silenced them. You could be admired for your discipline, but never pitied for your loss. Even their prayers were censored. They were expected to thank the gods for victory, never for mercy. By the time the Spartan Empire began to crumble, its women had become its final strength, and its final prisoners. When the men died, they kept the farms running. When the economy collapsed, they sold their jewelry to fund wars that could no longer be won. When foreign armies arrived, they didn't flee. They negotiated, because someone had to. The system that once enslaved them could not have lasted a day without them. In a twisted way, Sparta's experiment worked too well. It built women so strong they outlasted the men who designed their cages. But strength without freedom is still servitude, and courage without choice is just another kind of obedience. The women of Sparta were never truly free. They were functional masterpieces, engineered to look divine, but programmed to serve a dying god called perfection. Chapter 6. War as Worship. For most civilizations, war was a tragedy. For Sparta, it was a sacrament, Other cities prayed for peace. Sparta prayed for endurance, not to end war, but to survive it beautifully. To be born Spartan was to be baptized in conflict. The cradle prepared the soldier, the state prepared the soul. By adulthood, every Spartan male had already seen more violence than most men would in a lifetime. He had been whipped, starved, humiliated, hardened, not just to fight, but to worship through discipline. Their religion didn't require temples of marble. Their bodies were temples, and their prayers were push-ups. The gods of Sparta were not gentle philosophers or lovers of music. They were enforcers. Ares, the god of slaughter, Artemis Orthia, goddess of cruel rites. Even Athena, the goddess of wisdom, was honored for her tactics, not her thoughts. If Athens prayed for inspiration, Sparta prayed for sharper spears. Before battle, warriors didn't beg for mercy. They combed their hair, polished their shields, and smiled. It wasn't vanity. It was ritual defiance, the belief that dying well was holier than living long. To die for Sparta was not a possibility. It was a privilege. The only citizens guaranteed a gravestone with their name were men who fell in battle and women who died giving birth. Everyone else was fertilizer for the next generation. The battlefield was their church. The phalanx, rows of bronze and flesh, was their altar. Every shield overlapped the next, each man protecting the body beside him more fiercely than his own. This wasn't brotherhood, it was geometry, perfection through formation. When the line held, it was like watching a living wall breathe. When it broke, Sparta broke with it. The most famous of these ceremonies was Thermopylae, a mountain pass turned temple of sacrifice. 300 men stood against thousands, and for 3 days they fought as if death were a spectator sport. To later generations, it was heroism. To Sparta, it was maintenance, proof the system still worked. Every cut, every drop of blood was a receipt confirming their ideology still functioned. They didn't fight for victory. They fought for validation. Back home, the citizens didn't mourn the dead. They honored them with silence. Mothers didn't wear black. They walked in public proudly, as if their sons had just graduated from humanity. When one mother learned her son had survived by retreating, she lifted her skirt and shouted, "Back to where you came from." It's hard to tell if that was courage or trauma speaking, probably both. War consumed everything: economy, education, even leisure. Music existed only for marching. Feasts were merely refueling sessions, and laughter was allowed only if it didn't echo too long, because joy might remind someone there was life beyond duty. They didn't just fight wars. They were the war. Every citizen, every law, every heartbeat synchronized to the drum of discipline. And as long as the rhythm continued, Sparta looked immortal. But immortality demands a price, and Sparta was already paying it. A city built entirely for conquest eventually discovered it had no idea what to do with peace. The enemy was no longer Persia or Athens. The enemy was boredom, and boredom, for Sparta, was fatal. When soldiers returned home between wars, they found themselves strangers, men who couldn't speak without command, fathers who couldn't raise sons without barking orders. They had learned how to conquer, but never how to live. War had given them purpose. Peace made them irrelevant. The system that once created gods of war was now turning them into ghosts of routine. Their prayers still reached the heavens, but no one was listening anymore. Chapter 7. The Legacy of a Machine. For 3 centuries, Sparta seemed invincible, a society that had done the impossible, forged order out of chaos, discipline out of flesh, and fear into faith. But perfection is a fragile thing. Even steel rusts. Even gods get bored. By the 4th century BC, the cracks had begun to show. The Agoge still trained boys. The army still marched. The mothers still smiled. But the city behind them was hollow. Fewer than 1,000 true Spartans remained, and each one carried more armor than optimism. Their obsession with purity, the very thing that built them, had become their disease. By killing weakness, they had also killed renewal. When birth rates fell, they didn't loosen their rules. They tightened them. No foreign marriages, no mercy, no compromise. And so, the same system that had once dominated Greece slowly began to starve itself of people. By 371 BC, Sparta met a new enemy, not in Persia, but in a small city called Thebes. The Thebans didn't fear Sparta. They'd studied them. They knew the machine had gears but no soul. At Leuctra, Sparta's invincibility finally cracked. Their walls of bronze broke against an army that fought for something Sparta had forgotten: hope. In a single day, the myth of perfection died, not with a scream, but with a sigh. After the defeat, the world didn't rush to destroy Sparta. It simply ignored it. No one feared them anymore, and that was worse than losing. The city that had defined itself through battle found itself surrounded by silence, and for the first time, silence wasn't sacred. It was empty. The last generations of Spartans tried to revive the old fire. They revived the Agoge, the whippings, the speeches about glory. But the people no longer believed. They obeyed out of habit, not faith. They were maintaining a ritual whose gods had already left. The mothers still told their sons, "Come back with your shield, or on it." But by then there was no one left to carry the shield home. When travelers later visited the ruins, they found old men training in the courtyards, throwing spears at targets no one was watching. One asked why they still practiced. A Spartan answered, "Because that's what Spartans do." He smiled, then missed the target. And that's the truth about Sparta, not the legend carved by Hollywood, but the warning whispered by history. You can build a world without weakness, but you cannot build one without humanity. A state can shape perfect soldiers, but only compassion shapes people. Sparta forgot that, and perfection, stripped of empathy, always devours its creators in the end. If this story made you rethink the myth of Sparta, if it reminded you that history's heroes were often humanity's experiments, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who still believes strength is the same thing as perfection. Because here on Untold Time, we don't worship history's idols, we expose their cracks. And in those cracks is where the truth always hides.